is going to begin. All right, Deb, when you're ready, feel free to give it a second or two more. You can get started. You are
muted, Deb.
You are muted, Deb.
I see that now. I've been meaning to take lip reading lessons for Zoom, just so that all the muted people, I can figure out what the heck they're saying to me. All right. So I'm still gonna. No, I guess we're 1 minute in. I'm happy to go ahead and get started. So let's introduce ourselves first. So Shelley, I know everybody knows you, but if you'd introduce yourself. With an unmute. There you go.
I can only claim potentially 20% of the people here, Deb. There's no way everybody knows me. So hello all, I'm Shelley Stahl. I am located on the East Coast of the US, and I work for the American Geophysical Union, and I'm our vice president for data leadership. And I really am excited about International Data Week and this particular BoF. I'm very excited you all are here. Deb.
So Martina.
So my name is Martina Stockhause. I work for the German Climate Computing Center. And in my second role, I'm managing the IPCC Data Distribution Center jointly with colleagues, and that will be my use case. Deb.
All right, and I'm Deb Agarwal. I'm at Berkeley Lab, and I manage a repository, and I'm also involved with several earth science data sets, and they'll be my use case. So we prepared a few slides and a few discussion things first, that just to introduce you to the topic that we're talking about, and then we'll leave plenty of time for discussion as well. So let me start with the presentation. Let me just get that going. All right. Oh, I'm so glad to be on real Zoom. Okay. So I didn't manage to get Martina's affiliation back in there, but it's the four of us have been organizing things. So Shelley, Leslie Wyborn couldn't make it today, but Martina and myself and Leslie and Shelley are co-chairing this effort. So what is this effort? So the complex data citation problem is this fact that in many of the cases when we're publishing any kind of a research work, particularly with data and software now being part of our citations, we're at a point where there's more citations than your average publisher wants to see in a document, and it's caused a great deal of problems with publishing. It's tended to cause that people want to ask you to put it in the supplementary materials. We're right in the midst of publishing another paper where yet again the publisher said, gosh, that's too many citations. Why don't you put all the data ones in the supplementary material? So I can assure you it is a real problem that's happening for most of us these days. And this is just one example of a paper that we had, that exhibited this problem. And, in this case, the figure on the right is actually based on 177 sites worth of data from the global FluxNet. And those 177 sites, the requirement for utilizing their data is that you must cite them, which means 177 citations that should have been there in that paper. The figure on the left is actually 212 of those sites. So therefore, that would be 212 citations for that paper. And actually, there were already 259 citations in the paper that weren't even the data citations. Okay, you know, so by definition, this paper, if it had all the citations, would be at 471 citations if they'd included all the data citations. Now, in this particular case, in order to sort of deal with some of this and to make this a citable entity for these sites, we had actually included all the authors of that data. And even there, they wouldn't allow us to have all the authors we needed. They cut us off at 500. So we had to limit every individual site to only a few authors. So it wasn't ideal, but that was the workaround that we ended up making in order to make that work. So what do we want to do about this? Well, our objective is to find a means by which we can enable direct citation of a large number of papers, software, data sets in a paper, but by providing a means to collapse them into a small number of references, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. So we want to allow direct citation of the group of research objects and or the constituents within that group that you've collapsed, right? And empower an individual to directly cite these large numbers of research objects. And what I mean by directly is treating those as primary citations, right? A lot of people have been given the guidance, well, you have so many data objects that you want to cite, write a data paper about the analysis you did, and then cite the data paper in the main paper. The problem with that is then all of those data objects get one citation, that data paper, and then the data paper gets all the citations from that. And so, well, even then, the data paper even just gets one citation, and it's the paper written there that does. So it becomes fairly untraceable in terms of the citation indexes and things, because it's very hard for those data sources to then be able to count up how many citations they've actually gotten. So we want to, and there, that's the key. We want to enable that appropriate credit tracking, of that direct citation that occurred. And one of the challenges in talking about any of this is the fact that there's a lot of collection mechanisms out there right now that have been proposed. And so we wanted to come up with a unique name to be referring to this collapsible reference container that we're talking about. So we came up with the word reliquary. I know immediately you're going to say, oh my God, I hate it. But that's the whole point. We want it to be replaced with another name, but it serves its purpose for now. It's fairly unique. No one else is currently using it for this purpose, so it works. So, when we think about the properties we're aiming for, in a reliquary, we want that reliquary to have a unique identifier and well-defined citation components for the reliquary itself, that it would always appear in the reference section of the paper if parts of the reliquary or the whole thing was used, that it can contain citations of objects from many sources and repositories, right? So often when we've talked about this, you see the use cases, and many of them are all coming from one repository. So there's a temptation to think, well, just have that repository create this collection and do all the work for this. That doesn't work because a lot of these papers, in fact, are citing a large number of repositories and sources. That you can track that primary credit. And ideally without requiring any help from some other entity out there, right? That you could do it because it was indexed as a primary citation. For the research objects citations in the reliquary, those would need to have a unique identifier within the reliquary. They're going to have descriptive metadata needed to cite that research object outside the reliquary, and then it's findable from its description in the reliquary, right? So that you could go find that original primary source. And we've been, so in order to pursue this, starting in 2020, we actually started up a community of practice, and that was Shelley and Carolyn Coward and Chris Erdman and myself who started this up. And we met, I think 5 times now, maybe 6, as a large group. And that group has contained publishers, infrastructure developers who've been building a lot of these different types of collections, and a set of use cases that have come to light. So you're gonna hear about a couple of those, not all of them, but we actually do have a nice set of use cases. So the activities to date, as I said, we started up in 2020. That was at the December American Geophysical Union meeting. And we reached out to build that community of interest. In our meetings in 2021, we developed a common agreement on what it is we were trying to talk about, not in fine detail, but at least to the point where we all thought we probably understood what we were talking about. We presented these use cases, which you'll hear about later today. And we discussed the various potential existing mechanisms for implementation. We came up with this crazy name of reliquary, thanks to Carolyn. And then we, the next thing we did, which I think was really informative, is we tried to make sort of draft, I called them cocktail napkin descriptions of the reliquaries. So that was where we just wrote down in sort of a paper form, what would I want to have in my reliquary, and what kind of information needs to be there. And so each of our 3 main use cases built one of those. And so we have those. And in 2022, we had a meeting in May where we presented those cocktail napkin versions of the reliquaries. And the next plan here is to really look at how do we start developing prototype reliquaries using the existing mechanisms and figure out if we can use an existing mechanism, whether there's augmentation required, what it is we need to do to make this work. So the use cases, you'll hear more about those, but one's the British Oceanographic Data Center, one's the IPCC, and another one is sort of environmental data sets, and that's the one that I have. So the existing mechanisms that we looked at, they're everything from the collections, the RO crates, the dynamic data citations, making data papers, thinking about whether it makes sense to just have structured supplementary materials, right? Since everybody's pushing us to the supplementary materials, maybe the right answer is to just structure that. Zenodo has been doing some work in this space. And I know there's lots of things that we missed, but these were some of the big ones that occurred to us and participated in our meetings. So this is kind of what the cocktail napkin version of the reliquary looked like, and it was just in a spreadsheet, where we're just filling out, well, okay, here's sort of what this thing would look like for my use case. What's it going to need to have in it? And you can see here, it's got, the relevant parts for its citation. It's then got the citations of the individual elements. It's got identifiers in there. And so all of us work through these cocktail napkin versions of these. And at least thankfully for at least the 3 use cases we have, this was not a bad starting point. We all felt like we could create something that was usable for us in this sort of form. And so the next steps that the community of practice thinking would be to actually, and this was what we charged in May, though I don't think there's been any motion forward yet on it, is to actually start trying to build out these use cases using some of the existing mechanisms to try and see how well can we represent these use cases, these cocktail napkin versions of the reliquary as real reliquaries. And as part of that, then, once we have that, one of the other steps is to then work with the publishers and indexers to make sure that whatever mechanism we're starting to move toward, that we know how it looks end to end and how it would work, and can confirm that it would be indexable and all the other things that we'd like to have. So now I'm going to hand it over to Shelley.
So just to give you a sense for the broad urgency, why this is something we want to work on right now, something we need to work on right now. And we're hearing about other use cases, and others are welcome to join us. The pressing need for representing a publishing house, so that's the American Geophysical Union. We have 23 journals. We run into a lot of challenges when we ask our researchers to cite their data, which by the way is a requirement, and then they come back with 50 or more citations within the reference section. Now, technically, this is not a challenge. We have the capacity to have an unlimited number of citations, but when you're managing them all and you're trying to validate them all, it becomes a real problem. And most other journals are not going to be willing to do that. And so there's a large number of folks in the journal community that are actually hoping that we'll figure this out within this team. And they're waiting to hear exactly how the recommendation is for it to work. So the journal community is standing by. And I say, we used to talk about 100 citations or more, and in actual practice within AGU, I'm getting a lot of pushback at 50. So that's why I changed the slide. Deb, that's why I changed the slide to 50, because it's continuing. It's a great problem to have because we are making our authors cite, but then we have this other issue where we're challenged. Then last night I was on a SciDataCon talk supporting reproducibility, and this was the Cure FAIR team briefing out on their work, and there was a report on research reproducibility packages, and this is an excellent use case as to why we need to figure out these complex citations, because that package will include everything needed to reproduce research or reproduce an effort. So that's another use case. Reiterating, number 3 there, reiterating what Deb talked about. If we're going to have a collection, if we're going to have a group of cited entities, we have to make attribution and credit work. The children of the group have to get proper identification and credit for the use of that data set or software or whatever it is. I've noticed physical samples there twice. We have been talking to the folks working on citations for physical samples, and we're hoping this is a way, especially for the IGSNs, to be included within a paper. Right now, it's really difficult to include the IGSN numbers. They're normally embedded in with the data set and not directly attributed. So this is one potential way that might work for them, or they could consider including their IGSN. And then we're really pushing computational notebooks and executable environments for better reproducible research. And guess what? Those include multiple types of products, data and software, visualizations, and more. How do you cite that? And we need a way to do that. And we're thinking this particular type of citation will could be one of those solutions. And then the importance of linking everything together. So Deb was giving the example of the flux towers being, or the data sets from the flux towers being in a data paper, and then citing the data paper, but not giving attribution back to the flux towers each time it's being used. Same here. We want to link everything to the researcher, the paper, the data, the software, all in the instance, commonly with a publication, but it could also be for other efforts as well. So there's just a number of reasons that we need this quickly. The problems are real, and if we want to make data and software a first-class research product, we have to figure this out. So Deb, that brings us to introducing the use cases. Do you want to set up Justin and James, and I'll get the
Shelley, we have a question in the chat from Rama. It's a question for
I want to answer it.
Yeah,
if I can. Or Martina, do you want to answer it?
I'm fine with you answering it.
Okay. Yeah, I was just starting to type out my answer, and I thought, well, it's going to be easier to answer here. So there's a couple of things I left off of that. I tried to make my intro brief so that we make sure that we have lots of time to discuss. But there are two things that I left out of the intro. So one is that these reliquaries, we need that they're not just something that a repository can create. We need that individuals who are trying to write a paper could also create a reliquary. And Rama's question is fantastic. It's really about, well, isn't this the same problem, Deb, as you just said about data papers, where you only end up with one citation, the reliquary? And the whole idea here is that this reliquary is specifically identified as a reliquary and treated differently by the indexers, where in fact, and this is tricky, so we don't yet know how we're going to accomplish this, and that's part of why we need you to be part of this, is, you know, the idea that we need is something where you could have put the reliquary as a reliquary, so that's clearly identified as something different from a standard collection in that reference section, and that in the text of the paper, you could have cited elements of the reliquary, right? So that you have a way to do that, and that the indexers can easily find what all's been cited and count the things in the reliquary that have been cited as individual citations. Right, so the idea would be that the indexers are treating this entity of a reliquary different from how they would a collection, and they're actually having to open it up and use those indexes inside there. And it's going to take a bit of brainstorming to figure out how we can enable that, but I think, you know, that's sort of the ideal that we're aiming toward. Does that answer your question, Rama?
Yes, thank you.
So Mark and Mark pointed out that the reproducibility and credit issues are distinct. I agree, but I think and maybe we should. I mean, maybe we should let Martina go next, because her use case is really about reproducibility as a piece of it. So I don't know, Shelley, should we go ahead and do James, or have Martina go next?
James is a recording, so Martina can go next, and then we can pull in Justin and James. Yep. It's perfectly fine. Martina, are you okay doing that?
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
Yeah. And as you're bringing your slides up, I also agree with Mark, and the solution to the two problems has to be considered separately. But we've included both in the requirements for the reliquary. Great. Looks good, Martina.
Okay. So if there are any problems on my connection, please stop me, then I will switch off the camera. So my use case is about the IPCC, and first of all, this is a view on what an IPCC means. So first of all, we introduced what we called FAIR guidelines with the guidelines in which we want to enhance the transparency of the AR6 and enable the traceability of results and the reproducibility of figures. So that's what I will present to you, how we think we can use reliquaries to get closer to that aim. And the IPCC report, I start from right to left. So you have this report, the first part, there are 3 parts. I will concentrate on the first part. This report, in fact, is composed of different components. So you have different reports for different uses. So a summary for policymakers, a technical summary, and the real final report. You can access additional materials on that web page. So it's not just one written report. But if we concentrate just on one of the reports, like the summary for policymakers, you can think about that as an extended abstract. Then when I move to the left side, you can say that the writing process or the assessment is concentrated around peer-reviewed literature, which is used to write the report. So that's the traditional way or the center of what the assessment is about. And secondly, you always need data to create the figures. That has not been explicitly mentioned anywhere. So data was not cited until the AR5, for instance. And for the AR6, for the first time, we cite the data within the report in an annex, and we record the creation process of the figures in the supplementary materials. So what basically the authors do, they have different kinds of input data, they create their scripts, apply that, and then create the figures. And we store the figure data as well. And for some of the chapters, a provenance record would be available, but that's just something we might discuss in the end because I've never mentioned that. And if we look a bit more technically, the IPCC does the same as most of our model intercomparison projects. So if you analyze model data, you usually use the results from different models. And then if you look into CMAP6, you have different DOIs, so you access data from different groups. In CMAP and for the high volume data, you usually don't have a DOI per data set because that's not the way you want to give credit, because you give the model run is the object, or all the data which is created in a model run is in the end the created data and is cited together usually to give credit. But within you can identify each data set by a handle. So that will be important for the use case. So as said, usually if you do an analysis of the data, you select very few data sets across multiple model results and maybe further data sets like observations. And that is the bundle of input data sets that you use in the end and that you should cite and give credit for. So usually we have the problem that if you use the model data and cite the DOIs, that you cannot reproduce the scientific result because it's just not enough information. And on the other hand, if you want to do the reproducibility, you have the handles, but no reference on the authors. So the handles are really only for identification, the data sets, and not for citation. They lack the metadata. So if you want to focus on reproducibility, you have to use the handles. And if I get to my use case, if you want to cite the data in a figure caption or something, you get this long list as Deb has already introduced, which is just impossible to cite. So the idea would be that we bundle the input data sets that were used to create a figure and leave out all the other parts which are created by the authors themselves. So just to have a reliquary to give credit to those who created data which was used to create the figure. So and as Deb already introduced, what we want to do is not really focus on citing the reliquary, but citing the content of the reliquary, or how Shelley put it, the children within that. So what I think is the benefit for the IPCC reports is that we could give credit with the reliquaries, with the content, because you can assign the credit to the authors of the content of the reliquary, but you can also use it for reproducibility, because you have all the fine-grained detailed information in the reliquary on the data sets themselves. And with a reliquary, you have only one reference or citation, which you could include in the figure captions directly to have it in the report. And the challenge, I think, if I reflect the experience in the AR6, is really to have something which is easy to use. So we have two groups. One part of the authors which use good tools, which create provenance records, which include every detail on handles on citation. They are pretty well to create the reliquary just to include it in their code. But there are others who just work with writing their own scripts and creating their data. And for them, we really need an easy approach so that they can create such a reliquary. Yeah, I think the challenging part, we will come to that. It's just that the direction of the granularity changes here. So in the reliquary, there are handles for the CMIP6 use case, but they are part of a larger collection as well. So I thought at the start it might be challenging, but I leave that to the discussion. So with that, I give back to Deb.
Thank you so much, Martina. So Shelley, if you want, if you can queue up the, I think Martina, you need to stop share. And then Shelley, if you can queue up James. So the next use case is the biological one, and that's from the Ocean Observatory. And they couldn't make it at this time of day, so we've got a recording for them.
Yep, 1 second.
And by the way, the sound starts a little bit late into the recording, so just hang with us.
Hang on a second.
And Carlo, yeah, thanks for that second link. That does appear to allow us to get the Word document.
And here we go.
So good morning. James and I are going to present some foundation work we did at the beginning of this work before the IDA group was formed. And it's the use case that we have for the British Oceanographic Data Centre in the UK. I'm going to give an introduction and the conclusions, and James is going to share the methodology in the middle. These slides were initially created last year, and they show the use case, which has evolved slightly, but this effectively sets the scene of what we're looking for out of the RDA group. So at BODC, we host a number of data collections. We have data from what we call the series schema, which has effective data from research vessels and effective toes instrumentation, packages that go over the side like this, which go to the ocean bottom and come back. We have effective sample schema, which has it's a collection of the samples we take, so biological samples, chemical samples, also got core data in there. And we also developed an autonomous platform data system, which holds data for effectively ocean robots, which is a massively emerging field at the moment, especially with net zero. And we effectively host many of our collections on the BO2 website. And when people access the data, they need to be able to cite it. That's one of the key drivers of this work, and effectively our motivations for putting this use case together. And James is now going to go through that use case.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. The use case we have is what we would like to do is to put DOIs on the accession. So this is the originator format of the data that we receive. DOI in that, at the moment, we hold around 8,000 accessions of data, but the granularity can be a bit mixed. Oops. Yeah. Okay, sorry. The use case that we have is that we want for the accessions, DOI on the accessions, data from studies is submitted, and this is the originator format. The granularity, as I mentioned, can be a bit finer. So you can have multiple levels of data within the DOI accession, and these we put a PID on. Each element with the collection can currently be accessed by a web URL link, and the collections range from possibly 175,000 over 5 million plus data granules. From that, we do get some complexities of a PID or an element maybe within 2 separate DOIs. So we want to also capture that information. And when someone comes to collect the data, they then come and collect the data from ourselves in this value-added format that we have created, and they can subset this in a query based on temporal or spatial elements that they desire. They can also come, we can also broker the data to additional services, so something like CDataNet or ICOS, and these PIDs will then go to these brokerage services. Once that's done, you've got this amalgamation of various different people collecting different types of data sets, or different services collecting different types of data sets. So what we want is to be able to actually still give the credit to the originators that provided the data, but we also want to identify the actual data that we used. So if someone came and collected the data from the DOI, they could just cite the DOI. If they got the data in this value-added format from the PID, rather than creating lots and lots of DOIs with additional metadata, we can provide the PIDs at that point in time of in the format that they're in. And ultimately, at the end, if a user comes and collects the data, they can then put a DOI or an identifier on the data that they've collected from ourselves, alongside any additional information, so methodology, code that they've used to tidy up the data, or grid and create a product on top of the data that they've collected, and even from not just from BODC, but from other providers. So they could be pulling in PIDs and DOIs from other providers. And for this, with the next stages that we're looking at are starting to look at how this might look in terms of providing lots and lots of variable data sets, and how you can actually get back to the original source and give the original credit, and also identify what data have been used in a reproducible, sustainable way.
So when we've looked at this work, we looked at both DOIs and PIDs, and effectively the difference between the two, and where you'd want to use a DOI and where you'd like to use a different type of PID. DOIs are metadata rich. They require significant human interaction to mint them, because we need to create abstracts and we need to connect it to other metadata sources. And there's strict constraints to metadata updates. And effectively, there's a cost of about 10 cents per DOI. So we need DOIs at that accession level where the data is submitted to us, or at the product level. But between that level where we've actually got the small data granules, we think we need some other kind of PID, be it handles, epics, or cool URIs. Got much lighter metadata. They'll be more sustainable because we can automate their production, and they're much, much cheaper. But the key thing that we need to actually make that key piece of work that we need to progress that is need to define a minimum metadata model for the granules themselves, which fits very neatly within what we need from this RDA group in terms of how much metadata we need in each granule. We've also, through this work, identified other use cases that this work would actually facilitate the citation of the data. One is high volume image data. So our research vessels and our autonomous platforms, they collect HD video and also imagery. And you get millions of images per expedition. And effectively, you can put PID in each image. Where a species is identified in that image, you can actually cite that particular image within that collection that comes off, that has a broader DOI associated with it. And we've got the beginnings of this type of approach with our first high volume data on one of our other data centers here. It doesn't have those PIDs on those granules currently. And our secondary goal on this is effectively on providing metrics to users, effective people that submit data to the data center. So we have this accession DOI James has described. We put the PID on as granules that are within there. You get the PIDs or DOIs on data products or aggregations, and you get DOIs on research publications. You can effectively build that PID graph, and then you can effectively, once that PID graph is up and running, you can actually track the usage of that data and give metrics back to those originators from one angle. And the other angle at the other end is you make the source data that underpin the DOI that someone's downloaded unambiguously citable. So that was the use case. Just thank you for your attention, and we hope to be actually in person or actually connected remotely to a meeting which is a little bit closer to us in future years. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Shelley. All right, so I actually also prepared a few slides just showing some of these environmental use cases that I have. In all cases, mine are much more simple than Martina's case and the ones that James and Justin just showed you. But I thought I'd just briefly show those. So one of those use cases is the Ameriflex data sets. Those are a subset of FluxNet that is just for the Americas. I help manage that data set. We're up to the point where there are 430 locations within the Americas that have data in this Ameriflex data set. And large numbers of downloads that occur. The data is regularly updated. And the data citation guidance that the sites have agreed to is that if you used one of these locations in your, in a research product, that you are expected to provide a citation for that particular location. Trying to avoid saying sites. So apologies for that, because that's always confusing. So I'm referring to these Ameriflex sites as locations just to help with that. But just to give you some context, each of these individual locations is run by a separate team. And many of them have been collecting data for 20 to 25 years. with a large number of people working at that team. So it is, it's easy for us when we look at the dots on the map to think, well, that's just a collection. Let's just make it a collection and cite the whole thing or something like that. But there is a real feeling that there is a significant difference to the value of different locations where there's Ameriflex data, and there is a preference, a strong preference from the data teams that in fact they get individual citations. And that's been a challenge. We have a large number of papers that have occurred using Ameriflex data that have where all the citations, if they were provided, are in the supplementary material. So the other use case I already showed you in the beginning of the talk is FluxNet, which is then the global data set. And again, that's 212 sites right now, but a similar number of downloads and similar challenges. It's used often to calibrate satellite data. It's used often as part of some of the climate and weather forecasting and different things like that. So it actually sees a lot of use as a broad data set, but normally we would expect the 212 sites to be or locations to be cited, and that has been so difficult that's why we wrote the paper that actually is the one where these images were pulled from, is because people are finding it so difficult to follow the citation guidance that we came up with, that we would just write one data paper. But even then, we ran into the problem of that 500 authors was not enough. So it has been a real challenge. So one last use case that is a little bit more, I mean, the other two use cases for me, and the one from Justin and James, were all sort of one repository, one project, one thing, generating that data. So you can imagine a solution where everything sort of comes together at that project or repository. You heard from Martina's use case that's not true in her case. But I also have these projects where I can show that this is not the case. So these are two different large-scale projects within the Department of Energy in the US where they're generating long-term data sets that they've been doing for quite a while. So Spruce happens to be a warming experiment that's been occurring for 10 or 20 years. The Colorado East River Community Observatory is something that brings together a large number of different groups that are collecting data in the same watershed, and then publishing those data sets. And in both those cases, I list the number of data sets that are already in the repository. For those, I didn't list the number of institutions they came from, but it's a fairly large number of institutions, at least in the case of the Watershed Observatory. And you can see from this diagram that I show on the right here, and they're all from this same connected watershed. So for someone studying this watershed, they're likely to use a large number of these data sets. And so you can see where you'd hit 50 very quickly. And be outside of that range of the acceptable use. And in fact, we did write a paper just describing this whole observatory, and we immediately got the pushback of, you can't cite that many data things. And we said, well, it's a data paper. How can we not cite them? And it took about a week, and we argued back and forth, and finally they let us put all the citations in. But that is the reality for everybody right now, in trying to cite these things. All right, so I'm gonna stop there. And if I remember correctly, Shelley, we now have time for discussion. Yes. So I know that there's been a few comments in here. Carlo, that's a great point, that if you allow referencing of reliquaries inside a reliquary, you can create an infinite loop. But I think that it's not our intention to allow that, but but it's something we have to think about as part of this. And Mark, you're right. These use cases, I think what you're referring to is the fact that in both Justin and James's case and in Martina's case, we're talking about these PIDs where they're not necessarily a full, what we would have called a citation. Is that what you meant, Mark? And please feel free, folks, to ask questions and things. This is meant to be a discussion now. So, Mark, if you want to unmute and
Sure, thanks. I feel like every time I join this group, I'm like the contrarian. And because honestly, I still am having a hard time trying to figure out what exactly your problem you're trying to solve. And it seems like there's two problems that, as Chris says, are interrelated, but I think they're very distinct. And I think it was pretty clear in Martina's use case and in James's that there is the reference to, so I think of citation as a reference for the purposes of attribution and access. I think that's how Codata defined it, about a decade ago. And so from an access standpoint, that to me is very much a machine concern. We would like to be able to reproduce the workflow. And so we'd like to be able to say, and so a machine shouldn't care if there's 1,000 different links that it has to go get data from. And those just need to be precise and make sure that you get the exact data that were used. When we start talking about credit, it gets much more complicated because credit is inherently a human concern. And I just think that's where I get confused, is that I think, at least conceptually, we can do the reference for accessibility to the precise object very well. I mean, the implementation is difficult, but conceptually we know how to do that. The credit thing is much fuzzier. And like you were just saying, Deb, that certain Ameriflex sites are more important than others. And why? Well, because because Jane did this one and Jane's better than Bob, or I don't know. But so that's where I really struggle, is that my understanding is that you're particularly interested in the credit piece. And then also we get bound by the constraints of scholarly literature. I think that was what Shelley was saying. It's like, oh, no more than 50 citations. And then, of course, when we're talking about credit, there are the authors, quote unquote, of the thing, whatever it might be. But then there's other people that maybe deserve credit. So, yeah, I'm just throwing a lot of wrenches into the works. I'm sorry, I'm not offering any solutions here, except that I think it's really important that we make the distinction between these different concerns. Citation bundles up a lot of concerns. And in scholarly communication, we've sort of accepted that bundling. But I think when we're looking at these different sort of artifacts other than papers, we have to think outside that citation in the classical sense box. So yeah, that's all I'm getting at. Is so yeah, like I say, I think I'm always the fly in the ointment, but because I'm still really trying to understand the problem. And at the first level, we have to separate those concerns: access and credit.
I'd like to answer. Mark, I think you're absolutely right. And we've had some, not necessarily within this group, although a little bit, but we've had these the perception of credit or the interpretation of credit, or and that's really not. I think we're trying to separate how you interpret a thing versus providing access to the information to do the interpretation. And that might help a little bit, but you're really, you've given this a lot more thought, I think, than a lot of folks, based on your experience and the work that you've been doing over the last 20, 25, 30 years. So if actually you can help us tease apart the machine actionable pieces versus the human interpreting pieces. Because I don't think we're ever going to solve, I don't think this effort will solve the human stuff. I think we can take that to a group that can work through it, but it's not really here.
Okay, well, so what is here? So that, I guess that's what I'm getting hung up on is what I'm still really trying to understand the problem you're trying to solve.
So from my part, I think I can talk best from my part when, and that has its baggage, right? I'm going to come at it from a publisher part, which doesn't solve everything. It just is one thing, and causes other problems, right? So if you have research and you have a reliquary cited in the references section that holds all your data, your software, your physical samples, your images, your video, whatever, and it's all in there, and we've all agreed that that's the way it's to be depicted. So that agreement has not yet happened, but let's pretend it does. We cite it. This is the least amount, fingers crossed. This is
we cite it.
We cite it.
What do you mean by that? We reference it, we credit it, we provide access to it.
Oh, good. It's something that can be looked at. So it's not on a napkin, it's rendered somewhere, perhaps a landing page, perhaps somewhere. You can see what the children are. You can see what everything that's included in the reliquary. Likely there's a way to access everything that's included in the reliquary. That's a good question. I don't think we've actually walked through that detail yet. But the paper has one entry in the reference section. And that alone is a weird thing because this is not something you're referencing. This is something you've created. And the reason we put it in the reference section is because that's a legacy mechanism within the publishing space. So it's a bit of a mind bend that you put a new thing in a reference section that you're not really referencing, you're linking. So it's a different word. And it's the simplest way for a publisher to process it. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's the simplest way because it's all packaged. And all the publisher has to do is say, do I have the package? Yes, I do. Did it come from an entity that makes sense to me, whatever that means? Hopefully, yes. And then it can go through the publication process as one thing and be caught on the other side as a collection, such that in this part, we have to talk to the indexers, we have to talk to Crossref, we have to, and they've been part of the team. Crossref is a part of the team, DataCite's been part of the team. What it means to actually give attribution to the identified creators of those children. And so that's another piece of the discussion. What is that? Is it updating your ORCID? Is it Scopus identifying and rendering attribution for the creators for each of the children? Yes, we think so. We think the Web of Science should do that. And they've been part of the team. They, by the way, have trouble with the recursiveness. So we do have to figure the recursiveness out because that's something that's too much. So then once that's available as machine readable information, I think that's where we stop. I think that's the end of our scope. And then how it's interpreted is a different group.
Okay, so let me make sure I understand, because So I understand you have this package, this reliquary, and that is referenced in the reference section of a journal article.
Or elsewhere, but that's one example. Yes.
But I mean, we're really kind of focused on the journal article.
I am. For me, yes, we need the
And-
journals to do this.
Well, and scientists need that because they want to publish and
Right.
they
But-
need to reference their work, their
It could go-
sources.
It could go into the public access repository for the National Science Foundation too. That would be a spiffy keen use case in case that gets everybody's, gleekers going.
But that collection, in an ideal world, that a human could see that and say, oh, okay, that's a logical collection of a bunch of Meriflux data. I get that.
Yeah.
And the machine could say, oh, that's 500 different data sets that I can go access as I need to.
Yeah.
And so that's really cool. And so solving that problem in and of itself, I think, would be a good thing. But when we start talking about the attribution for all the humans that were involved in producing that reliquary, that becomes a lot more complicated and a lot more contextual and a lot more interpretive. And so it's like, the contributor roles taxonomy credit for papers, I think, has done a lot to sort of tease apart the different roles that go into producing an article. But as we found, that doesn't work for other types of research artifacts.
And you're working. So keep going.
So are we going to just, and I'm okay with this, are we going to set that aside as a complex human cultural issue and really focus on just producing a bundle of stuff that makes sense at a large sense for the human to understand, oh yeah, the Ameriflux data, but also makes sense to the machine in a very specific way to getting to the actual data that were used. And if we constrain it that way and we don't get hung up on the human attribution piece, then the problem is actually much simpler, because humans are way more complicated than machines, and precise reference to the data used is much easier to do than who were the people that produced the data, or that deserve credit for the. You see my distinction there?
Oh yeah. Deb, I think the answer to his question is yes, but I'm looking at you.
I think Deb was nodding.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes, that we're doing the actionable piece and not the people interpretation piece.
But enough of a people interpretation piece, because it seems like you're not throwing the people out. You're not just worried about the reproducibility aspect, the precise reference aspect. You want to sort of keep a little humans in there somehow, it seems like.
And I think what you mean by that is we want to enable the fact that we can credit these people, that like the work you're doing on data sets right now. So as that's moving forward, we're able to do the nuance of giving credit to the the postdoc, the data manager, all the work that you're doing. And you get those names on the landing page in the metadata with a standard format that everyone's nodded their head and said, yeah, that matters to me. Then the DOI or whatever the persistent identifier is, because we realize that there's others. So whatever persistent identifier is associated with that data set and that those folks that you have identified, that pathway is clear.
Okay, well, I don't think the pathway is clear, but there may at least be a path there. So I get this reference to the Ameriflux reliquary, the Ameriflux that I used for this particular study reliquary. And the machine then can say, oh, okay, I need all these data. I can get all that figured out. And then as a human, I can get a sense that these people are involved. But if I really want to understand it, then I probably have to talk to people and follow up and understand, but we
Because we
set
don't
that
have
aside for the moment
Yeah.
and just sort of say, there's some general credit here. There are lots of people involved. Human, you go figure that out. But machine, here are a bunch of handles or UUIDs or whatever they are that allow you to exactly figure out what data were used. But oh, everybody froze. But
no, I think we're processing. So Mark, I think this is fantastic. I want to give a few other people a chance.
Yeah, I should be quiet.
No, I don't. I'm not asking you to be quiet. I also want to get. So Chris, you had your hand up a little bit ago. Chris, did you have something you wanted to respond to or say or question? Chris Erdman. Or did he go off and go to bed? Maybe. Okay, Carlo.
Yes, can you hear me? I don't switch on my camera because it's 4 o'clock in the morning in France, so I have an horrible face. It's better just to hear my voice. I put in the chat a reference of a paper we wrote some years ago, back in 2016, where we exactly described the use case of what can be called a reliquary. You say you have a data set with a lot of references, and you want just to pack a reference to that into one citable PID. And it's at that point we saw the problem of infinite loop, because we worked with some editors of journals where we are used to publish. And they said, if we have to follow all the children of your core PID, then there is the risk of infinite loops. And another solution we tried was to use all the authors of the Sun PIDs as authors of the reliquary. You see, if you use all the authors of data which are you packing as authors for the package, then you solve the problem without go to children. But then you have a legal problem, because you're not sure that all the authors would like to be part of your reliquary, because they say, I'm not the author of the reliquary, I'm the author of something you are citing. So you are hijacking my name to build the reliquary. So actually there is no real solution. What the practice show that this is really a credit issues, because for reproducibility, what we built, and we built over the existing RDA data citation recommendation, perfectly works, because you put a reference, a pointer to somewhere. You have a landing. We typically use DOI. The landing page give access to the data set with all the collection, and there is a part references for all the data set used to compose the bigger set. So for the reproducibility, it's fine. For the credits, it's another issues, but it's where we were aware of the two aspects. And since we are dealing with more reproducibility, we are happy with this solution.
Thank you, Carlo, and thanks for providing the link to the paper. I don't think I'd yet read that paper. So I mean, it'd be great to have you get involved with this and bring your perspective, because you clearly have experience in trying to do this. I have this vain hope that we at least leave in building this mechanism reliquary, that we've left enough breadcrumbs there that the credit can be figured out, not from the standpoint of granularity of different roles or things like that, but just literally that the individual children in that reliquary, that an indexer or someone like that could find those children and identify the authors in it.
Maybe I can give a quick comment also. So with our high volume data, we always had the problem with these large number of data sets to cite. But in our use case, it's not possible to cite the children directly because we can only identify them. And the reason is that from the creator's perspective of the data, they do not assign authors and all the information necessary to really cite them for each data set. So we ended up that this bringing together all the authors of the children is not that easy to do, because you always have to look to which collection does this content belong to do that. And the other problem we had, if you really have children, it's not only a legal problem with the authorship, but also what's the order of your authors if you have hundreds of different children's in your container. How do you do that? So we ended up that this easy solution was not really possible to just say, well, all the children have authors and then we assign the authors to the whole. So we forth and back discussed on this issue of granularity, and we had different ideas with containers. We had the idea to have a container for metadata because this is detailed information which you cannot really provide elsewhere. So there's a whole bunch of ideas and approaches, and I think it would be good to capture different approaches here, as Deb said. So what is practice? And I think our approach is very flexible to take up a lot of approaches which are out there, which are used.
Thanks so much, Martina, and Carlo for bringing that up. We had another hand up by, I actually don't know whether you go by Rama or, but if you're still there.
Yes, I am here.
Excellent.
Yeah. A lot of things I wanted to say have got said, so I lowered my hand. But the main thing I was going to say was, it seems to me, talking about Mark's concerns, you've got a way of dealing with the credit issue somewhat, in terms of obviously the reproducibility thing with machine accessibility and all is sort of being taken care of. In terms of credits, though, if you have an overall citation for the reliquary where people who are involved in actually producing the reliquary itself get the credit in the citation there, and then each of the components or the children have their respective credits, whichever way they have been worked out. If they all have the appropriate credits, it seems to me the problem is solved in a sense. Am I oversimplifying things?
I like to think simply, so I don't completely disagree. I think what Carlo was bringing up is if those children are additional hierarchical elements, then you'd have a problem. But I suppose one way to deal with that is to not allow that, right? That anything in a reliquary, it's only one level deep. You know, that entity doesn't get parsed below that entity. Could be one way to approach that, such that you avoid recursion potentially.
Well, you could get an infinite loop if a reliquary is allowed to be quoted, and it traces back and it traces itself. It goes back to itself, then it becomes an infinite loop. But if it's a reliquary where you don't create loops, it should be okay.
Right, and I guess what I was saying is if we, I mean, it may be too simplistic an answer, but if you said that anything within a reliquary isn't parsed beyond its just base sort of citation or PID, regardless of whether it's a reliquary or not, it becomes, it can only become one citation, right? I mean, that would be one way to constrain the problem such that you couldn't get recursive. But I think, I mean, this is a lot of why we want to have this birds of a feather and continue with RDA is to get all of you engaged in helping us to figure this out. Because we know this is a really hard problem. There's a reason why it hasn't already been solved. And I think that, but we're all desperate to solve it. And I think that I'm hoping that desperation will inspire us all to find a solution. It won't be ideal. It won't provide everything that you know would be an ideal solution, but if it can even make significant inroads into this problem and make, you know, I'm positive it won't have everything that I'd hoped for, but if it even just allowed that there could be 300 data citations in a paper, and that those could be compact enough that in fact it would fit within a publisher's limits, I would be pretty darn happy if there was also a means by which an indexer or someone else could actually pick up those children and index them as having been referenced. You know, I mean, that's
Okay, so I think that, Deb, is your problem. I mean, I think at least conceptually coming up with a way that we can bundle a bunch of references that we can get to the right data is doable. Having it be indexed, see, this is, I think, where we're getting hung up in the scholarly communication fiasco. That it can be indexed, and that therefore that shows up on, you know, as a reference, as a citation on people's CVs and things like that. That's a whole different animal. And that's why I think we really have to separate those concerns. You know, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to credit all the people that were involved in producing the reliquary? And not, you know, not just the person who assembled the data, but all the people that were behind that data? Or are you just trying to make sure that from a good scientific standpoint, we can get to all the data that was used to produce a result? And I think it's super critical to separate those two concerns. And as soon as we bundle the human credit concern into indexing and citations and indices, then we're just perpetuating the existing problem of misguided measuring of people through scholarly communication indices. Does that make sense? I'm not seeing.
I don't think we're trying to. So currently, data is not counted in scholarly communication the way we want it to. It really needs to be like Scholix needs to, you know, be robust, and we need to make sure that the way the linkages happen needs to be robust. And I would agree that this is not ideal where we are right now. But if the means to do it, if we can work towards the means to do it and make it available to whoever is looking, which can include right now includes indexers. A lot of institutions depend on indexers to give them their information about their what's happening within their institution by their researchers. Sadly, we need that to be different. These are steps towards, I think, what you're talking about. So maybe your recommendation back to us is we're enabling it, we're not taking it further. We're getting to the point where an indexer can do this, or an automated system can do this because it's there. The machine readable pieces are there.
Yeah, and if it's doing that for the purposes of understanding what data were used for what scientific result, that's fine. If it's doing it to perpetuate the inherently flawed credit system of scholarly communication, and we're just perpetuating the problem that we've built over the last couple of centuries, that's a problem.
Yep. Okay, that's fact.
As much as I absolutely agree with you, Mark, that it's a problem, the data producers that I deal with view it as their only method right now of actually having value assigned such that they get promotions in their institutions for having produced this data that they've been working on for 25, 30 years. And so as much as it's broken, it's also the driving force for them to contributing it to these large efforts, to putting it in open repositories, to making it available, is to get that credit. And so if we're not recognizing that at least steps toward enabling that capability should be part of this, changing how that's counted, changing what's counted, changing all those sort of things, fine. I don't have a problem with that. But if I told all of the people who are putting data out in the open and contributing to these large collections that, we're not going to worry about the credit anymore, just put it in there, we'll make it machine readable so that we can make it reproducible, we can find everything, but we're not gonna count the credits, and we're not even trying. I will tell you that almost everybody contributing data, at least to my projects, is going to go, I think I'll keep it private then.
No, I hear you. And I totally agree with that. The thing is, so from my experience working on data citation for 20 some years, the researchers aren't actually interested in, if you really push them, it's not that they're interested. The only reason they're interested in data citation as such, and I use the term citation very deliberately, not reference, is that shows up on their H index. And as long as we continue to perpetuate that, we will create a problem that we're not going to be able to solve. And so I think that's good. So that I think what we're getting at is a way that credit can be teased out of this, but let's try and be as good as we can about not reinforcing that the only thing that matters is if you were cited in the literature, because earth science data has much greater value outside the literature. And if we forget that and we reinforce the literature problem, we're just digging ourselves into a deeper hole.
So I'm going to agree with you, Mark, because since we couldn't do anything with the citations, I mean, it was just too big a beast. We send Shelley after the big beasts, right? I mean, we just try to catch the little ones. In our case, like with Ameriflux, I mean, all we're doing is counting downloads and tracking those, and just providing that information to each of the site teams makes them so happy, because they can put that number in their next proposal and say, 3,000 people have downloaded this data. You need to pay me to create another year's worth of data. So you're right, there are other mechanisms, but I need something to enable me to count them at all.
Well, and so so I think we're vehemently agreeing, because So if I had some role in a reliquary, I can put that on my CV. I can tell my supervisor that, hey, look, this reliquary was used in a lot of different ways. But yeah, I've said it 100 times. Separate the two concerns, treat them as different problems, figure out which one you really want to focus on here, and don't bundle the concerns, because that just gets us into the problems that we've already established. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's really important to separate the credit and reference concerns of the reliquary.
Yep.
Thanks, Mark. So we have about 4 minutes left. Are there other questions? And yes, the whole idea of the term reliquary is to get it replaced. So if somebody, we should start a contest or something, but the whole idea was to make it so horrible a name that we would have to replace it, because no one wants me to name things, trust me. I have already named some things that everybody hates, but nobody can replace because it's been used for long enough that no, so no, don't. I literally wanted a name that we would have to replace. So please, let's find a replacement.
Maybe we can use the last minutes on the next steps, how we want to continue with this group. So maybe we should advertise that we have a Google Docs where everyone who's interested could put their name in. And I guess that Shelley will include those who sign up there in the mailing list.
Yep. As a matter of fact, my recommendation is to go straight and get yourselves onto the mailing list. That by going there, you're providing support to this work, making it into as a working group, and you skip a step of writing your name on yet another Google Doc and actually get into an actionable place as opposed to an unactionable Google Doc. So that would be perfect. And then the charter is mostly ready to go. We'll double check it and send it out in these coming weeks for folks to weigh in on. And here where we can be really specific with the concerns that are brought up in this session on, how we should scope our work. To Mark's point, which I treat very seriously, because that he's talking about how we value our scholarly work, and I do think that is an important topic, but this particular working group should stay away from it in order to make some progress. And we do have all of our sessions, save the last one, on a website where you can check out the recordings. I think Chris must have gone to bed. Hang on a second and I'll get you that. I'll get you that website.
And by the way, Mark, I want to encourage you to always speak up. I'm still fairly new to this game. I know you've got a huge amount of experience. It certainly helps me in thinking about this.
Thank you. I'm I am going to try and back off, though. I've made my point. Separate your concerns.
Oh, Bridget was asking, Bridget's going to be a working group out of the ESIG. We're gonna put it in there. The Earth and Space and Environmental Science Interest Group. So here's the website we've been using, but we'll have this all listed within the RDA site as well. I think it might actually already be there. But what this is the working sessions with the recordings. Save the last one because I think I went on vacation and forgot to put it up there. So I'll make a note to get the recording and the notes added to the website. All right. Happy day. The East Coast of the US is now into tomorrow. It's very exciting. Catching up with you, Martina.
Oh, we're all on Tuesday now, right? I mean, we're all on Korea time now.
Well, Deb,
I'm still on Monday. I'm still celebrating my Juneteenth holiday. Sorry, for many of you, you have no idea what that is, but it's a brand new holiday that we've had for all of 2 years here in the U.S.
And decades in certain parts of the US.
Yes.
And is a very worthy holiday for us to commemorate. And delighted. All right, thanks everybody. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording because I can.
Yeah, thanks everybody.